Forward TV. The world is thinking.
My name's David Perks. I'm a science teacher working in South London, and I'll be chairing this session, My Brain Made Me Do It, looking at the issue of neuroscience and how it affects policy in various different aspects. This session has been sponsored by the Science and Technology and Facilities Council and the European Dana Alliance for the Brain, along with the Institute of Ideas Science and Health Forum. Okay, we have got a very illustrious panel whose biographies are so long I can in no way read them out in great detail, but feel free to look them up on the website. And they've all got something very interesting to say about this issue. I thought, before I introduce you to the panel, I'd just raise a kind of the flavour of this debate. In the Times on Saturday, I picked out this bit in the body and soul section, mindless voters. A picture of the brain, which is always good to get the idea across, and it says basically that voters don't make rational decisions, they go on gut instinct, and that's something apparently that neuroscience has taught us. In fact, as the scientist behind this study, Todorov, says, voters are not that rational after all, so we may have to consider that when we elect our politicians. And I think it gives you a sense of some of the kind of issues where neuroscience is creeping in, and I'm sure more of that will come out from the introductions and the discussion. Okay, I'll introduce your speakers in the order in which we're going to take them. And first of all, we've got Professor Raymond Tallis, who is over there. And Ray was, until last year, Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Manchester and a consultant physician in the health care of the elderly in Salford. He's also, he wanted me to say, a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, so he has a real input to put into this discussion. He's also been quoted by Prospect magazine as one of the top 100 public intellectuals in the UK. He's a prodigious author with 3 books coming out next year. And also, more relevant to this discussion, he has an essay on the Times debate centred on this session, which you can feel free to contribute comments to, etc. afterwards if you want to carry on this debate in that way. The second speaker is Professor Pierre Magistretti. Oh, that's right. Yes. Yep. He's a Professor of Neuroscience and Co-Director of the Brain Mind Institute at EPFL and a Director of the Centre for Psychiatric Neuroscience at the University of Lausanne in Medical School and Hospital. His group discovered some of the cellular and molecular mechanisms that underlie the coupling between neuronal activity and energy consumption by the brain, which is very relevant to the idea of scanning technology that's used quite widely these days to give us some of the science, the neuroscience that we now use. He's also, more recently, the co-author of Biology of Freedom, which is published this year, if you want to follow his work. And third speaker, Professor Jeffrey Rosen, who's Professor of Law at the George Washington University and Legal Affairs Editor of the New Republic. His essays and commentaries have appeared in the New York Times magazine, which is a very, very good one. I was only reading yesterday on this very topic, which I highly recommend if you look him up. I think it was published last year.
Yes,
right. Atlantic Monthly, his radio, and in the New Yorker. The LA Times called him the nation's most widely read and influential legal commentator. So I think we're going to get some real insight there. And then fourthly and lastly, we've got Professor Steve Yearley, who's Professor of Sociology of Scientific Knowledge at Edinburgh University. He's primarily interested in environmental sociology and the social and cultural aspects of science. In 2006, he was appointed Director of Genomics Forum at Edinburgh University. He's also Director of the ESRC Genomics Policy and Research Forum, which is quite relevant in terms of the way that neuroscience is being discussed. Some of the issues cross over in that sense. So I've introduced our panel. We're going to give them between 5 and 7 minutes to speak, to let you hear what they think about the issue of neuroscience and how it affects the development of policy. And then we'll have a brief discussion on the panel, and I'll throw it open to questions and contributions from the floor. And if it was anything like this morning, it could be quite lively. Mm-hmm. So, without further ado, Ray.
David, thanks so much indeed. My brain made me do it. The idea is about that developments in neuroscience, particularly observations of activity in the living brain using techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging and so on, the kind of techniques that Pierre has been involved in developing, have shown that we're not as free or as accountable for our actions as we have traditionally thought. Now, this is potentially of great interest to defence lawyers who are, of course, licking their lips at the possibility of, to use Jeffrey's succinct phrase, placing the brain on the stand to take the rap on behalf of the client. They argue that blame lies not with the defendant but with his overactive amygdaloid body, supposedly responsible for aggressive emotions, or his underactive frontal lobe, supposedly responsible for inhibiting such emotions. If our brains are in charge and our bad behaviour is due to them, our attitude to criminal responsibility, to punishment, and to preventive detention of individuals thought to have criminal tendencies may all have to change. Well, I believe this conclusion is, to put it charitably, premature. Observations of the brain activity in the laboratory can explain very few things about us. If I speak with any authority, and David mentioned this, it's as someone whose research has been primarily in the area of clinical neuroscience. And indeed, I found techniques such as transcranial magnetic stimulation and functional magnetic resonance imaging and so on extremely useful in research. And that's why I'm very aware of their limitations. They certainly do not answer questions about the free will, and in particular about legal questions about the allocation of blame. Actually, we have no neural explanation for very basic things. The fact that perceptions are about things other than themselves. The way our consciousness coheres at a particular time and over time. Our relationship to an explicit past and explicit future. Our sense of being a self and our awareness of other people as having minds like ourselves. All of these, of course, are involved in ordinary waking behaviour. So the question in your blurb, which you'll see, how much can science tell us about behaviour? The answer is not much. The confident assertion that his brain made him do it, except in well-attested cases, such as the automatisms associated with certain forms of epilepsy, or the disinhibited behaviour that may follow severe brain injury, therefore lies beyond our current knowledge or understanding. And anyway, those who want to blame their brains for their misdemeanours should be challenged on philosophical as well as empirical grounds. First of all, why stop at the brain when you are seeking the causes of bad behaviour? Since the brain is a physical object, it is wired into nature, at large. My brain made me do it must mean ultimately that the Big Bang made me do it. In other words, neurodeterminism slides quickly into straightforward determinism. Are the brain blamers really wanting to deny anyone's responsibility for anything at all? And I'll come back to that. But interesting, there's a contradiction built into this plea of neuromitigation of blame. The claim my brain made me do it suggests that I am not my brain, even that my brain is some kind of alien force. If I were my brain, then my brain made me do it would boil down to I made me do it, and this would hardly get me off the hook. And yet, but if I'm not identical with my brain, why should a brain make me do anything? Why should this bit of matter single me out? The truth is, if my brain was simply impersonal, if my behaviour was simply due to impersonal brain activity, 4 of the words in the short statement, my brain made me do it, would look ready for the chop. Made and do go, because if I'm not an agent, it's hardly likely that my brain, which is a mere physical object, should be a voluntary actor. I can't refer agency to another place in the causal net. And me and my would have to go too, for in the impersonal world of physical determinism, my brain is ownerless. It's no one's brain, and the viewpoint that calls it mine vanishes into a net of causes and processes undeflected by agency, all the way from the Big Bang to the Big Crunch. The trouble is, my brain made me do it. It's a way of trying to have a particular brain both as a first person, me or my brain, and third person as a material cause, with all the innocence that material causes have. The brain is, of course, the final common pathway of all actions. You can't do much without a brain. Decapitation, ladies and gentlemen, is associated in most cases with a decline in IQ. Nevertheless, there is a difference between events that owe their origin to the standalone brain, for example, the twitching associated with an epileptic fit, and actions that do not originate in this way. While we do not hold someone responsible for having an epileptic fit, quite correctly, we do hold them responsible for driving against medical advice and causing a fatal crash. The global excuse, "my brain made me do it," would erase this distinction and indeed reduce the whole of life to a condition rather like status epilepticus. And this brings me to my third and final point. In practice, most brain blamers are not prepared to deny everyone's responsibility for anything and everything. While the brain is blamed for actions that normally attract moral disapproval or legal sanction, people don't normally pass responsibility onto their brains for good actions, or for neutral actions such as pouring out a cup of tea or just getting up for a stretch after a long sit down. When asked why he's defending a client, a barrister is unlikely to say, "My brain made me do it, Your Honour." And this pick and mix neurodeterminism is grounds for treating a plea of neuromitigation with some caution and a certain amount of cynicism. So we still retain the distinction between events, such as epileptic fits, that can be attributed to brain activity, and those which we attribute to persons, who are more than mere neural activity. Deciding on the boundaries of our responsibility for events in which we are implicated cannot be handed over to neuroscientists studying the activity of the brain in the laboratory. So the neuromitigation of brain has to be used critically and treated largely with suspicion, except in those instances where there is unambiguous evidence of grossly abnormal brain function or abnormal mental function due to clear-cut illness which may have its origin in brain disease. Our knowledge of the relationship between brain and consciousness, brain and self, brain and agency is so empirically weak and so conceptually confused that the appeal to neuroscience in the law courts, in the police station or anywhere else is, to say the least, premature and usually inappropriate. And I would suggest it will probably remain both premature and inappropriate for the foreseeable future. Neurolaw is just another branch of neuromythology. Thank you.
Well, Ray, I'm afraid I may detract to the battle of ideas because basically I agree with you. So no, I mean really. My point is, I'll make a number of points that are, of course, related to what I know, which a little, at least, as neuroscience. And the point, when one takes the sentence, "my brain made me do it," actually, I would say yes, but not because, as Ray said, it would be a third person. I agree with him. We are our brain. So I don't see a problem with that. Actually, I would say even more. I would say our body would make me do it, not obviously only the motor aspect of doing something, but the sensory aspects. In other words, how bodily feelings are important in decision making. And I will come back to this point in a moment. But let's go back to the idea of my brain made me do it, and we are our brain. I mean, could we actually say anything else, really? Could we say that's destiny made us do this, predestination, God, something of that sort of a metaphysical nature, which I certainly will not debate. I'm not certainly competent for this. So let's go back to science. We have a brain which somehow directs our behavior. It's at the basis of our behavior. So which aspects could we discuss in this? We could say, well, the brain works in a reflex manner. We have an input, a stimulation, and some almost like a knee-jerk reaction, the brain will respond. Of course, we know it's not the case. We have something more complex than a simple reflex going on whenever we respond to the environment or we even make a voluntary decision. So the brain actually is built, how the brain builds itself. This is the real question. Over time, with experience, and of course, there is the genetic constraints that are also there, which I will discuss, even though I'm certainly not in favor of what one could call a genetic determinism, not even also an environmental determinism. The point is that little by little, through experience, the brain modifies itself permanently. Of course, maybe at a higher rate in early developmental periods, but even in the adulthood. Tonight we will be different than this morning. Our brain will be slightly different than this morning. I think a friend of mine here in London, Robert Turner, said we never use the same brain twice. And I think he's absolutely correct. So how does the brain build itself? Well, through the mechanisms, and I will not expand on this except maybe for the discussion, through the mechanisms of plasticity. Somehow experience leaves a trace in the neuronal networks, and little by little there is a weaving of the connections that really builds the subject, builds the individual. We are the result of these processes, of this process of plasticity, through which experience actually makes what we are. So then where does one could say, well, okay, but still there is a genetic determinism. You are born with the genes to be bad or to be good, or an environmental determinism that could come into play. You could say, well, you were raised in an environment which is highly unfavorable, violent, aggressive, and of course, all you can do is copy this and become also violent and aggressive. Well, I think that fortunately we can escape this determinism. And again, I come back to this notion that is, I think, central to modern neuroscience, and I think much more constructive than neurodeterminism, which is this notion of neuronal plasticity. The fact that everything changes and at the same time, of course, traces remain. Of course, we remember what happened when we were kids. We learned geometry, we learned history. So these bits of information, these experiences are there, but then they can be remodeled over time, particularly as far as our emotional experiences go on. So I would claim that plasticity is really an integrator of two determinisms, and somehow through this mechanism frees us from this determinism. And I can elaborate later on that. So then I mentioned one point, which is the body and the feelings, the sensory aspect of the body in the decision making. So when I said when we say our brain made me do it, as I said, we can even say our body made me do it. And as I said, it's not only the motor aspect, which is obvious, but the sensory one. Well, what is clear is that for each perception, and of course for each trace of this perception that builds our brain with time, there are bodily states that are associated. Just think of an experience where you were afraid, you had fear. Well, there are bodily states that are unpleasant, that are associated with it, increased heart rate, sweating, and so on and so forth. And we can say that basically we have markers for the traces that have built our brain. And this goes back to William James. It's been re-actualized by Antonio Damasio in a very nice book, which I highly recommend to read, which is called Descartes' Error. And the idea is that in Damasio's conceptualization, which I actually basically agree with, is that we can anticipate the state in which we will be, and this anticipation will orient our decision. If we have two possibilities to act, we will tend to choose take a decision that will put us, or we can anticipate a bodily state which is less unpleasant than another one. And so feeling the internal state in which we will be is a very important determinant of what we do. So the body is just as important as the brain in the decision-making process. And in fact, a region of the brain which is known to be clearly involved, there are many, but certainly one which is very much involved in anticipating the bodily state in which we will be, pleasant or unpleasant if we take a certain decision, is the frontal cortex, the forward part of the brain. And Ray mentioned very briefly actually organic states of the brain, which we could say our brain made me do it. He mentioned epilepsy. I think we can also add lesions of the frontal brain, because there we cannot anticipate, because of this lesion, what are the state of the body in which we will be, and then it's a basic random activity that is taken. So a last point about okay, just 1 minute. Okay, a last point is, yes, okay, this issue of bodily state in decision-making is interesting, but it really boils down to, at least as a first approximation, to pleasure, unpleasure. And here, I think notions such as drive, in other words, the engine that will drive us to do something, to give act to an act, is is this notion of pleasure and unpleasure. Unfortunately, they may be a bit confused because sometimes, and many people, and it's just a consideration about humanity these days. If these mechanisms would work, we should live in a heaven where everyone was looking for what is actually a positive outcome of its acts. Unfortunately, there are problems with that, and I will stop here. But to conclude, I will say, yes, my brain may do it. We are our brains, and we are our bodies, and that's very simple and straightforward.
Thank you.
I became interested in the question of neurolaw last year when the New York Times Magazine asked me to identify the next big thing in law, what was going to be the technology that was going to transform our legal system. A law school classmate of mine, Owen Jones, who teaches at Vanderbilt University, told me that he was hoping to receive a multi-million-dollar grant from the MacArthur Foundation to study the effect of neuroscience on law, and said that he wanted to make Vanderbilt the Los Alamos of neurolaw. So this is great for an article. I knew I had something. And the article described the debate between techno-enthusiasts like Jones and techno-skeptics. We've heard from two skeptics. In the interest of keeping this panel relevant, let me describe the enthusiast position, because if I don't, you may ask, why are we all here to discuss a topic that has no relevance and no importance? The enthusiasts claim, essentially, that neuroscience can transform the legal system in three areas, involving the end of traditional notions of guilt and responsibility, involving the transformation of technologies of lie detection, and finally, and most creepily, involving the prediction of future behavior. What about the end of responsibility? So the date that neuroscience arguably began to transform the legal system was in 1992, when a man pushed his wife off of the balcony of their 12th floor penthouse in Manhattan. He was understandably tried for murder, and he claimed, "My brain made me do it." He introduced a brain scan showing that he had a spot on his amygdala, which is the emotional region, and as a result, he wasn't able to conform his behavior to law. His prefrontal cortex wasn't able to restrain his amygdala, and therefore he should be excused from responsibility. He was called Spider Systkov because the cyst on his arachnoid membrane looked like a spider web. The judge tentatively said the evidence could come in, and the prosecution was spooked enough by the possibility the jurors might be swayed by this that they allowed him to plead to a lesser charge. So this was the beginning of neurolaw. In what ways has it continued to influence the legal system since then? It's becoming de rigueur in death penalty cases, when defense lawyers will claim the client's brain made him do it. Under the low standards for mitigating evidence in death cases, the evidence has to come in if it has any relevance at all, whether or not it ultimately sways the jury. But although it comes in, it tends not to sway all that many jurors. Few people have gotten off because jurors agree with the brain made me do it claim. Nevertheless, it's becoming an important part of the sentencing stage. The Supreme Court is showing evidence of being interested in neurolaw. In the case Roper versus Simmons a few years ago, the court's majority said that juveniles at the age of 17 should not be executed because neuroscience evidence suggested that their brains were not fully formed and therefore they were not able to conform their behavior to action. Now, this is what's called confirming the bleedingly obvious. Everyone knows about the impulsivity of teenagers. But there were many people who were worried that the casual use of neuroscience evidence might indeed open the floodgates to this brain made me do it claim. Now, there are some enthusiasts who go even further, and this is where things begin to get really interesting. They claim that in light of studies showing that really we are utterly the products of our brain and we have no free will, the whole traditional notion of insanity should be thrown off. So there are these fascinating studies by Benjamin Libet, who noted that when people are told to move their finger randomly whenever they feel like it, their brain signals a readiness to move the finger 500 seconds before the actual movement, and 400 milliseconds, yeah, that's a lot of seconds. That's only for the very slow among us, who take 500 seconds to be tired, yeah. milliseconds, half a second before the actual movement, and 400 milliseconds before becoming aware of the conscious intention to move the finger. This leaves 100 milliseconds not for free will, but what some have called free won't. In other words, you can veto the impulse that your brain has already determined you to do. And building on these experiments, these enthusiasts say, how can we have a traditional notion of insanity? The old insanity defense, based in the English Monotone case, says that you are held responsible for your actions unless you can't appreciate the difference between right and wrong. But these enthusiasts, like Robert Sapolsky at Stanford, say you might appreciate the difference between right and wrong, but literally be unable to control your behavior. You're like a broken brain is like a broken machine, and therefore you can't be held responsible for your freely chosen actions because you have no freely chosen actions. Obviously, this is a new concept of responsibility. Traditionally, people are held responsible unless you act under duress, with a gun to your head, do it or else. Or if you have a serious defect of responsibility, you can't tell the difference between right and wrong. This new claim is that you should be absolved of responsibility even if you understand the difference between right and wrong, if your brain somehow is not functioning properly. But who's to judge what a properly functioning brain is, a normal brain? The questions are vexing indeed. So that's the threat or the challenge to traditional notions of responsibility. Then we have a series of interesting new technologies that claim to improve lie detection very well. Polygraphs, the old lie detection technology, are not very accurate. They're in the 80% range, which is not high enough to satisfy the American Supreme Court standards for reliability. The brain detection devices are now in the high 80s or early 90% range. They hope within 5 years they'll get up to 95%, which might indeed make the technologies admissible. There are two different kinds of lie detection technologies, one called no-lie fMRI, which is now used, you won't be surprised to learn in divorce trials when people want to prove their reliability, basically puts people under the scanner and asks them to lie consciously. In other words, they'll be given a card and then asked whether they have the card, and they'll say they don't. Based on the patterns that the brain emits during the lie, you can create a pattern or profile of the lying brain, and this supposedly can be useful to tell whether people are lying in other cases. Then there's another technology called P300, which can show you pictures, for example, of a training camp in Afghanistan. And if you happen to have been there, your brain will light up in a particular way. If you haven't, it won't, and this could also be an effective form of lie detection. Obviously, if these technologies became accurate enough to satisfy standards of reliability, they could be tremendously important. Not only could people establish their credibility, but you could be truth tested. And if you refuse to go under the scanner and take the test, that could be a sign of culpability. There would be vexing questions about whether you could be forced to be truth tested and so forth. And finally, in more science fiction, like the prospect not only of binary, are you lying or not, but memory downloads, where it's hoped that you could actually hook someone up to a machine and see a physical representation of all of their memories. This is in the science fiction arena, but the possibility of some meaningful lie detection stuff is on the near horizon. The final area where neuroscience could transform the law, and I'll conclude with this, is in predicting future behavior. This is the stuff of phrenology and eugenics, of Lombroso and ideas of biological criminality. But some neuroscientists like Adrian Raine have argued that the prefrontal cortex of convicted murderers has reduced activity, and antisocial personality disorder can be profiled based on the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. You could imagine a system where a suspected enemy combatant was shown the picture of the training camp. If it was shown that he'd seen it, he was brain scanned, and if his amygdala looked really funny, he was preventatively detained without cause for years. This raises the deepest questions to traditional notions of responsibility. English and American courts have tended to hold you responsible for what you do, not for what you think. And the possibility of being profiled and detained based on thought crimes is chilling indeed. We can talk during the discussion about whether these predictions are more or less likely to come true. I ultimately agree with the skeptical position that this is not a technological question, but a political and moral one. Politics alone cannot tell us about the mysterious point at which people should be excused from responsibility because they're not able, in some sense, to control themselves. That's not a technological question. It's a political and moral question, and we'll have to decide it ourselves. Thank you so much.
Finally, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. As an employed sociologist, I, of course, have to maintain that it's fundamentally a sociological question rather than any of the above. So, I mean, it seems to me that there's an interesting issue going on here, which is to do with, as it were, how we explain human conduct or human action. I mean, if you think about, last 2,500 years of intellectual endeavour, the way we explain most things have been fundamentally changed. I mean, how do we explain what gravity is, or how do we explain descent or connection between different species? How do we think about the movement of bodies in the heavens and so on? But in a sense, we've been fantastically conservative about how we understand human action. I mean, if you go back and read Aristotle or something, you think, well, it's a bit bonkers, but I can see what's going on here. I can understand the notions of, the incentives to action and the way in which action is understood. And it seems to me that in a fundamental sense, we've kept the same kind of paradigm for explaining and understanding human conduct for, the last, n thousand years, where n is back as far as you can have any written account of what people's notions of explanation is. And of course, we extended this form of, purposive explanation of human conduct to other things as well. So, I mean, by and large, God, although being a bit more powerful than the average human, nonetheless acted in kind of the ways that we did, and, Satan did, and so on as well. And if you look at the history of the human sciences broadly considered, you can see that in a way, what we've often tried to do is to bring other things within the same explanatory paradigm. So that in a sense, you could see Karl Marx as saying, well, classes act a bit like people do. Or you can say Freud saying, well, the unconscious, that's, it's a bit like having a person inside you that's a bit badly behaved and wants to do things and you're trying to swat them down. So that in nearly every endeavour that we've tried to explain other things which sort of intervene or meddle with human conduct, we've often adapted the same paradigm for understanding human conduct. That's purposive. You're thinking about the ends, what are the means to achieve those ends, a satisfaction of goals, and so on. And we've freely attributed those to other things, to, as I say, to God, to classes, to the unconscious, and in a sense, early evolutionary theory kind of, attributed that to the purpose of evolution. Now, it seems to me that there is something fundamentally interesting going on about the times in which we live. And I realise that it's, I guess, it's the folly of every age to think that they live in a particularly interesting time. But maybe we do, which is that I think that we now have some serious challenges around for understanding the boundaries of the human and the natural as they apply to the human. So most of you will know that about 15 years ago, Bill McKibben, a New Yorker writer and all-round good guy from East Coast, wrote a book about the end of nature, which was about the way that humans were collectively despoiling nature and we were losing this sense of nature as a wild place. And I think one of the, I think it's a very nice book, some very nice ideas, but I think one of the things that McKibben missed is the way that we ourselves remain a kind of repository of nature. That is, there are a lot of things about us that until recently were only natural. We didn't have much choice about these things. We didn't have much choice about our attributes. We didn't basically have much choice about what our children came out like. There were lots of natural facts about ourselves which we didn't have much control over. And I think one of the things that's happening now with the advances in the understanding of human genetics and reproductive technologies, and potentially through the understanding of genomics, is that this bit of nature, which was kind of off limits until recently, is now becoming something that we can hope to have some kind of technological attitude towards. So that there's a conflict going on between this age-old paradigm of purposive intentionality as the basic way of explaining things, and beginning to think of ourselves as the subject of some kind of technological and instrumental application. Now, that's not to say that people haven't wished to have that before. You could see the kind of behaviourists as trying to do that, except they were just hopelessly bad at it. But maybe we can begin to think about doing some of these things now. And of course, obvious things there might be to do with enhancement, that if we began to find ways in which we could enhance mental or intellectual performance, well, then people would start experimenting with that. But then it might become an issue of responsibility of, well, why didn't you? You could have been cleverer, so why weren't you? What kind of, what's the expression? Deadbeat dad, are you? What kind of deadbeat person are you? You couldn't even be bothered to plug in the extra cassette to make you a bit smarter. Now, I mean, so I think that we are at a point in which we're beginning to think about the brain as part of nature, and that fundamentally offers to transform our relationship to the brain. And it's obviously not just the brain, it's the hormone system and, you know, all the other bits of your body in a way. But it's the way in which this internal nature now potentially becomes available for treatment in some of the same ways as external nature. Now, what does this mean for the brain made me do it? Well, I guess we've all had that, you know, I still remember very clearly my undergraduate conversation about this, you know, where I was living in a shared house with a bunch of people, and one morning we had a big argument about determinism. You know, that thing about, you know, is my action caused, you know, and it's the molecules, and you could understand the formula, you know, then it was kind of inevitable that I burnt the toast or whatever thing it was that I'd done that morning that caused the argument. Now, of course, in some sense, you know, that kind of Laplacian idea of, well, if only I just had, you know, a big enough computer and stuff, I could work out why everything happened, and there's a kind of determinism to things. You know, I think everybody's had that conversation and has had that very deep moment, and then has realized two things. One, there is no computer that could do this, so it's a kind of an idle thing. You know, the universe probably is the fastest simulation of the universe that there could possibly be. So you know, taking into account everything, you couldn't predict it any faster than it will happen. So that's kind of pointless. It might be some kind of video game you could play in heaven, but otherwise it's of no purpose. The other thing is that even if we had some other kind of language for doing these kind of things, it's hard to imagine, you know, what that would be. You know, you read these kind of philosophical speculations about, you know, people, rather than saying, oh, I'm feeling a bit hurt by the way my mother treated me, or whatever, there's no Freudian disclosure in that, you know, people would say, oh, these neurons are going, or, you know, something. And then, you know, the question would be, well, what would be different about saying, you know, my KP1XZ is fired, from saying, you know, I'm really, yeah, fine. I'm really upset with the way that my mother's treating me again, or whatever. So there's a sense in which if you try to turn everything into my brain made me do it, you gain everything and nothing. You know, the world is just the same. You just have redescribed it in a way that is, you know, is not necessarily richer or more informative than what we have. Now, the third thing I want to say is the way in which, you know, and as Jeff very interestingly pointed out, a lot of the interest in my brain made me do it has come from the law. That is, people wanting to bring this forward as, you know, excusatory in some kind of way. Now, of course, one of the interesting things about the law is, as it were, to study the kind of epistemology of the law, or the way in which the law treats knowledge. I mean, there's a writer in Sociology of Science that many of you may have heard of, Sheila Jasanoff, who, based in the States, who's done a lot of work on science and law. And one of the interesting points that she keeps making is what she calls the kind of the legal positivism of the legal system. I mean, so that in a sense, the law is a refined system for getting at what it sees as the facts of the case. You know, where were you on that particular night? Do you or do you not have this particular spidery thing in your brain or whatever? But often the law is immensely positivistic in that it makes things turn on facts without having a very sophisticated notion of how the facts relate to particular theoretical stances, or what it takes to make a fact robust under particular circumstances. And so one of the concerns that I have about this is that this my brain made me do it discourse isn't necessarily coming from philosophy or the neurosciences, but it's being driven by law, and that I think we need to understand something about, as it were, the sociology of the legal process and the way in which expert evidence is brought into law. And in some ways it's that worries me more than the philosophical background to this. So really, just to finish, I think that what's interesting about this topic in general terms is that it addresses a way in which there's a danger that this paradigm that we've had for understanding human behavior for the last millennia may be becoming destabilized or less certain than we would have assumed until recently. But what concerns me more about that is, where is this challenge coming from? If it's coming through the US courts, then I suspect that it's not going to be necessarily the smartest way of addressing this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I don't know about you, but I think there's a lot on the table at the moment. So I'm going to sort of try and throw a question out and see if people pick up on it. I've got two questions really. One idea which I think Geoffrey raised about this idea of free will being challenged by the neuroscience that says basically that you act and then you think about it or justify it in reverse, so to speak. I mean, I don't know how people on the panel will think about this, but I was speaking to a colleague of mine who works in the field of neuroscience, and he says, well, we don't actually think about everything we do, but some things we do think about. And in other words, you know, you could see yourself, well, neuroscience could come up with and say, yes, you have some kind of things that you do automatically. You've trained your brain to cope with. But when something's different, something matters, that's when you think about it. And doesn't that kind of sort of blow the gaff on this idea that neuroscience is really trying to undermine the concept of free will and what it means to us?
Free.
Anybody want to have a go?
Oh, I mean, I'm dying to. But I mean, Jeff, you first. I mean, I think Benjamin Libet. Sorry, my brain made me do it. Sorry, you want to get
My mother taught me to be polite.
Yes. I'm sorry, my amygdaloid body was just ahead of my frontal lobes. That was the problem, yeah. I mean, Benjamin Libet's experiments are worthwhile thinking because they're absolutely central to some of the things that I agree with, the panel said, and some of the things I disagree with profoundly. And Pierre really tried to put me off the scent by saying he agreed with me. We're actually in profound difference, so you'd be glad that until we get paid for our appearance. But I mean, essentially, Benjamin Libet's experiments, and do you mind if I sort of tease them out a bit? I'm sure Pierre as well. He
As
did
long
some.
as it doesn't take too long.
Take about 30 seconds,
Right,
almost as long to form an intention. What he said essentially was that if you looked at people and you asked them to perform some simple task like flexing a wrist, and you timed your intention, but at the same time the neurophysiologist timed the appearance of the readiness potential that said you were going to do this act, the readiness potential appeared before your intention. Hence, all you had discretion to do was to stop something happening rather than actually initiate it. In other words, free won't rather than free will. Libet himself has been very much against the determinist interpretations of that, and he's for very good reasons, because this plays really into what Pierre is, where I disagree with Pierre. If we look at the situation, it isn't just somebody cocking their wrist, or a wrist cocking in isolation. It is somebody who's agreed that morning to attend Benjamin Libet's laboratory and to participate in these complex experiments and prepare themselves from 9 o'clock in the morning or whatever participate. So the whole intentional field has been established hours before he had to cock his wrist. And that's what freedom is about. It's about a field of activity and a field of choice. And that's why I'm worried about what Pierre said, because he sort of said he was his brain, and then, no, he thinks he's his body, and I'd like to know, does he mean his body as a piece of meat? No, he doesn't. He means his body as conscious. Does he mean his body as an isolated monad as conscious? No, he means probably a body that's interaction with other bodies and so on. What he means ultimately is the thing that made him do it is actually the self, who's part of a community of minds. So, and it's a bit like Libet. The experiment Libet, you look at a brain, but what you actually see is a performance of a self in a community of minds.
Can I, Geoffrey, yeah, and then I'll come back to you, Pierre. Yeah?
The real techno-enthusiasts start with Libet, but they have one other series of experiments that are often cited, which may be worth putting on the table. This is the famous trolley experiment. So imagine that you are standing on a train track and the train is about to hit 5 people. If you pull a lever, it'll veer off and kill 1 person and 5 will be saved. Most people presented with this hypothetical says, yes, it's worth doing, save 5 by killing 1. Then change the hypothetical and imagine that you're standing on a footbridge and there's a fat man in front of you, and you can stop the train by pushing the man with your own hands over the bridge and killing him and having him crush the train and save the people. Most people say that they would not do this in these circumstances. So Green and Cohn at Princeton hooked people up to an fMRI while they were presented with this hypothetical, and they found that when you're presented with the first one, which most people will do, your prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for deliberation and rational decision making, is pretty active, and your amygdala, the emotional region, is relatively suppressed. In the second one, this horrifying example of killing someone with your own hands, the amygdala gets very heavily activated. They extrapolate from this experiment the idea that ultimately we are not freely choosing rational beings, but the product of this material interaction between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and other regions of the brain, and for this reason responsibility should be excused. The only thing I want to say now, besides just descriptively stating that, is it doesn't seem clear to me that this would necessarily be a good thing for all defendants, because after all, the entire idea of mitigation is based on an acceptance of responsibility. You can be spared the death penalty if you agree that you acted wrongly. But once we've thrown out the idea of responsibility entirely, then mitigation might go out the window too. And you might, if this is the crux of the matter, if the whole purpose of punishment is not retribution, you should be punished because you did badly, but deterrence, you're basically a broken brain, a broken machine who has to be kept off the streets and prevented from killing again, that might lead to more executions, not less, because you don't care how responsible people are. You just want to stop them from killing again.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, 2 comments on the last 2 comments. So the first one, this one, actually, I think it makes a point I tried to make, the example of the trolley, because you're faced with 2 possibilities, and in both cases you killed someone, but somehow the emotional involvement of pushing someone or just pushing a little button or something that will change the course of the track is quite different. I mean, the emotional involvement of pushing someone physically from the bridge will generate, I mean, this is the idea, a much more unpleasant situation in which you can relate directly than something which is more mediated, which is more indirectly. And this goes back to what I was saying in, actually, again, citing mostly Damasio's work, how important it is the anticipation of the bodily state in which you will be pleasant or unpleasant or less unpleasant, which will be determining in your decision. That's why I say your body made it do it, because I think the sensory part, and in particular the interoception part of the body, in other words, detecting how your body will be or can anticipate how it will be, is quite important. And so it doesn't help much what I'm saying about the law, because I'm just focusing more on the, let's say, neurophysiological underpinnings of this. Now, for the law, I agree. I mean, basically, it doesn't detract any responsibility whether you do one or the other. I mean, in both cases, you kill people, so it's not something good. So, but from the physiological, just to understand, when one says my brain made me do it, again, I'm just going back to this notion that it's your brain, but also your body in the sensory aspect. Now,
Can I
sure.
just try and throw an idea at you? Because I have a problem with the way that's posed, because to me, what you're saying says that if you look inside the brain, you see a picture of different parts of the brain acting, and that somehow explains the fact of what you felt when you did that. Which comes first? I mean, is it the fact that bits of the brain light up control the way you feel about it and your actions, or when you do it, bits of the brain light up? I mean, personally, I don't know what my brain does. I know what I feel.
No, I mean, this is a central debate since William James, basically, in the biology of emotions. I mean, James and Lange were saying, basically, we have fear because our heart rate is faster, because we're sweating, because our body in a certain state. And Cannon and Bard, 20 or 30 years later, said, no, it's all wrong. We are afraid, and that will modify our bodily state, and that's why we, and actually, it's, I mean, 150 years later, or almost, it's still a debate. I mean, I tend to follow William James's and Damasio's approach than Cannon and Bard, but I think it's open.
Okay, all right. Steve, you want to add anything? Oh, sorry.
Wait,
no, I mean,
Pierre has a second point.
I'll try to. I am not sure I understood. Again, not that I want necessarily to absolutely agree with you, but honestly, I don't see where we disagree. So, a point I would like to make, maybe, which I couldn't address or expand on in my initial presentation, is, as I said, okay, we build this brain, and eventually we kind of make a, let's say, an integration of this determinism, genetic and environmental, through the mechanisms of plasticity, and every day our brain changes. But again, what really is the motivation? What really will make us do something? And when I say us, it's, from my point of view, our brain do it. Well, I think here we have a couple of terms to define and a couple of issues to address. And in particular, the difference between instinct and drive. I don't say that's the solution, but it's just a tool to begin thinking of this. I mean, instinct is something that I see as being mostly active in the animal world, with pre-programmed behaviors, highly genetically determined. You know, if you see a pheasant courting a female pheasant, it's very well mapped and very well organized, and it's genetically determined. You can find basically the same behavior across male pheasants. If you see a human male courting a human female, well, it's very variable, I would say. I think you will agree with that. Exactly. And so we definitely do not have an instinct for, in terms of, as I define it, as a pre-programmed behavior for reproduction, for example. So drive is something which is typically human. It's really this interplay between what we have in terms of representations in our brain and in terms of what we have in terms of representation of our bodily states. And we tend to go for homeostasis, maintaining a certain equilibrium, a certain bodily state. And then drive, I think, comes into play in this notion of pleasure and displeasure. And pleasure is what really tends to bring a homeostatic situation. And yes, so I stop.
Because otherwise we won't get out to the audience.
It takes time to explain these things.
I know.
But okay.
I've got two very brief things that I'd just like to mention. I mean, one is that I just want to endorse Ray's point about the extent to which that we're talking about brains, but in some sense we're talking about selves, and of course selves are importantly social, and I mean, so the way this question is framed, you know, looks at, as it were, internal nature, whereas I think it's manifestly clear that behaviour is conducted in a social context, and that it's a lot of interpersonal or what sociologists often call intersubjectivity. That is, you know, my behaviour makes sense to me partly in the way that it makes sense to other people. We don't have, we're not only thinking about ourselves selfishly outwards, but we're thinking about how do we look to others, how are our actions made apparent and justifiable and understandable to others, so that ourselves are much more intersubjective than we're probably inclined to think within the Western tradition. The second thing I wanted to say is about, as it were, a kind of disciplinary conflict between the law and philosophical or even neurobiological approaches to this, which is in a sense that in law you're always concerned with exceptions. I mean, that is the person who's charged wants to be different from everybody else in having this abnormality. Whereas, what is philosophically important is what we all have rather than what sets us apart. And so I think that, that again, the legal route in some sense may be a bit of a distraction in trying to answer the bigger philosophical question, because it's always looking for things that this person has that everybody else don't, whatever. That makes it possible to say, well, that's why they did this errant or unusual thing. Whereas the big stakes neurobiologically come from understanding what is general rather than exceptional.
Okay, we'll throw it out to the audience, but I would just throw in one tiny weeny bit, because some of the interesting stuff, I mean, I'm not sure whether we proved that free will still exists or not, but some of the interesting stuff is why this stuff is turned into policy rapidly. The law's one example, but education is stuffed full of this stuff, and teachers in here, they'll know multiple intelligences or any other ideas about how the brain works are told to you to tell you how to teach and how to understand people's development, whether that makes sense or not in its own terms. Right, okay, we've got microphones. If we start down the front with this young lady here, and then I'll try. We've just got one microphone. And the next person, this lad over here, down.
I can't help but think that there's a bit of a philosophical point being ignored or missed here, in that the brain and if people don't like this analogy, then I can use a different one. Your brain and your rationality and your character and your free will are distinctly separate things, or my science is limited. My knowledge of science is limited to GCSE level, and I'm very sorry if anything I say is scientifically incorrect. Please correct me by all means. But the animal instinct part of your brain and the bit of your brain that is rational, as it were, are distinctly separate. And I think there are plenty of instances where the animal instincts part does overrule the rational part and the moral part. For example, in cases of manslaughter, where you have an individual is threatened and they kill someone in order to save themselves, that is clearly a distinct case in which the animal instinct part of your brain is completely overruling any kind of moral knowledge you may have, or any of your morals that are in your brain to begin with. As a result, I think you can certainly have instances where your brain did effectively make you do it over the knowledge you have of morals.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, yes. Is that on? Yeah. I'm actually being asked to research this by a youth organisation looking at the brain development of hoodies in South London to see if they are able to have free won't. And I think the focus is it will definitely not actually come into the decision of guilt or innocence in the court of law, but actually what are we doing with young people in young offenders institutions? Are we actually going to try and rehabilitate them, or are we going to just keep them there until they're over 18 and eligible for the adult penal system? This is the point of touching on plasticity of the brain. If we take that as a given, up until people haven't decided on the age that it ceases to be plastic, but is there opportunity for change, and is there opportunity for rehabilitation? And that, I think, is where neuroscience can potentially shed light, rather than did my brain make me do it? Well, until we can separate the brain from the person, they're both going to have to go into a penal institution.
My name's Justin Kilcullen-Nichols. I'm a science teacher, secondary school. I'm seeing this shaping society in a very worrying direction. It's a question of responsibility. No one likes taking responsibility for their actions when they get something wrong, but this is a way of taking away the responsibility for their actions. 2 examples. First of all, with regards to the obesity crisis we have in this country, it's never the fault of them eating too much. It's some kind of genetic link, thyroid problem, hormones, whatever. And secondly, as David mentioned, in the education system, as a teacher, I am continuously drove crazy by the number of alphabet syndromes we encounter: ADHD, ADD, ODD, which ends up as odd, which is quite appropriate. What are we teaching the kids about the real world and responsibility? The number of kids you get who say, I have ADHD, it's not my fault. Okay, fine, fair enough. What's going to happen to these kids when they go out into the real world and try and get employment? That excuse isn't going to fly with an employer.
Okay, thank you. Is he got... Oh, he's disappeared. Right, just one just right in front of you.
Can you hear me? I mean, are we afraid to think ourselves of not having a free will, because all our system is kind of based on we have a free will, we have rewards and punishments and everything. If science kind of comes to show that slowly we are not as free as we think, does that kind of destabilize the whole system? So we are kind of inherently afraid to think ourselves of not having a free will.
Okay, we'll just take one more, this lady here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Two very quick points. Number one, if we accept, for example, this idea of our brain made me do it, we can also accept that my brain made me not do it, especially what you're saying about this idea of the free won't. But I am very worried about this idea. If we can actually prove that there is something neurologically wrong with someone's brain, then we can obviously intercede again with Victorian lobotomies and all that sort of thing. And we're already in schools, I mean, I'm a teacher as well, seeing situations where children are given Ritalin, children are given Prozac in an effort to try and somehow normalise them with our idea of what normality is. And just on a purely humorous level, if you have a serial rapist, which part of their body do they actually keep their brain in, you know?
So we go quickly around the panel and we won't respond to any of the questions put out, and then we'll come back out to the audience. Jeffrey, you would like to?
Sure, many interesting points. On your very resonant suggestion that there are times when the animal part of the brain can literally overrule the rational part, my understanding, which is not very advanced either, is that this is too simplistic. So I was put in an fMRI and told to imagine various punishment levels for various horrific crimes. A guy stabs his father, someone else pushes someone across the street, and so forth. And my brainwaves were recorded. The hope of the experimenters, this is my friend Jones, who's got all this money to study this stuff, was that he would see the amygdala, the emotional part of the brain, literally struggling with the rational part in especially emotionally inflaming bits, and the rational part would come up when there was a good mitigation or excuse. He thought he'd see the two struggling. It didn't happen that way at all. The first thing I learned is that I'm the harshest punisher that they'd ever had in the fMRI, which was bad news for my kids and my law students, I guess. But they did not find that this struggling effect. In fact, the amygdala activity was the best predictor of which punishment level you'd do, and the prefrontal cortex didn't seem to be interacting much. Now, these are preliminary results. It may not mean too much. I know that my colleagues will tell us more about this, but it's too simplistic to imagine that there are just these two parts of the brain. The other strain, which was very important, was your suggestion about rehabilitating the kids, and yours, ma'am, about the creepiness, the Victorian lobotomy-like quantity of enhancement or normalization, which you touched on as well. There is this technology called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which can stimulate particular parts of the brain. They can inhibit people from lying, for example, in some experiments, and also inhibit you from getting pissed off and refusing to play trust games by depressing, basically, one of your lobes. This raises the deepest questions about what it means to be human, about the conditions under which normalcy should be imposed. And at this point, I liked everything you said. It was a wonderful presentation, but the sort of cheap stab at the American courts at the end, I think, was too glib, because if there's to be any hope, any response for something like this, we're talking here about notions of cognitive liberty and autonomy, and what it means to be human, and the immunity between the state and the individual. It probably will come from the courts, and the American courts, for better or for worse, are better at actually formulating these principles of privacy and free expression and so forth than most other courts, because we have a pretty strong civil libertarian tradition. So we can talk, if you like, more about what those principles would look like, but given the stakes, I think we may actually need a judicial response.
But just on what you said, though, but there is a real tendency in the States to want to drive this technology in. The lie detection thing strikes me has been, almost before anything's been proved. Companies are set up, you'll know, Lie Inc. Company set up, and then making huge claims for what this science can do in the law. And in a sense, it's kind of a slightly irresponsible actions on the part of the scientists making claims for this, which in effect is no different to a polygraph. I think I'm not so sure that the answer's in the law when science itself is, quite complicit in seeing this technology pushed through. We would respond to that.
Well, the courts will ultimately decide when it's reliable enough. And yes, it's a capitalist system, so there are plenty of people who are trying to make a buck on it. I don't think it's wrong to be exploring the technology. So I also took a lie detector test and was told to think of faces and places. So I thought, first of my wife and then of my house, and I was trying not to think of anything improper. It was a very fraught test. Came out, and they said, we can tell you when you were thinking of faces and when places. And they could, because there are localized areas of the brain that light up when you think of faces and places. So this is could be of legal relevance. Now, to move from that to what faces or what places are you thinking of, obviously, is more troubling, and that's further down the line. But I guess this is my response. You were worried that the law was distorting the philosophical debate, and obviously I'm worried that the philosophy is distorting the legal debate. It's a practical concern, but there's no need to worry. What we have to have is a conversation about the appropriate boundaries between law and responsibility. Those are questions that can't be answered, again, by science by itself or by philosophy. They're ultimately political choices of the kind that we've made whenever the law has confronted new technologies. We're debating now whether it's an entirely new question or whether it's just a different version of an old question. But it's a real question. It'll develop at some pace, and that's why we're so lucky to be having this discussion.
Yeah.
Well, maybe a few points. First one, animal brain coming up. Well, I also think it's too simplistic. I don't think there is an animal brain in us necessarily. It's just what the point I wanted to make is that animals have certainly many more pre-programmed behaviors, genetically determined, which, of course, that closes the window for free will. So that's really the point. As to the imaging, and maybe coming on this, yes, I mean, lie detectors may turn out, this imaging techniques applied to lie detection may turn out to be better than the current polygraph. I don't know, I think possibly, but basically the message is that to tell a lie, you have to engage, it's more work for the brain. I mean, you have to engage a few more areas, and of course, if that's really reproducible, maybe it's maybe more helpful than the polygraph. But again, I will limit my comments to the neurophysiological aspects, not so much at what that brings, the concept of lie detection in the trials. And then another point, which I think is very important that you raised. I mean, there is this idea of mind reading. You know, with brain imaging, we will be able to see what people think. I mean, as Jeff said, I mean, there may be what imaging will bring is and brings already, which areas are engaged in a certain function, and in particular, a certain area of the brain lights up when you think of faces, because this is more active than others. But never, I can really, I don't know, we'll see maybe in 200 years, but I really don't see how brain imaging could provide the content. I mean, one can see which areas are engaged, what category of thinking you're having, but certainly not tell you what you're thinking. I mean, I think this is an important point, because you read here and there brain mind reading, and that's scary. So it's sure, okay.
Right. I mean, this issue of free will is you don't get it in one action or one moment. It's basically about building yourself. I mean, one's freedom has great temporal depth. The freedom I have, such as it is, has been built up since I was a neonate, responding to inputs. And gradually and slowly, my brain, yes, it has been changed by my experience, but more important, I've sought out experience in order to change my brain. It's the whole me that's come to this meeting to have my brain changed. And that's pretty normal. You know, when you think about education, you think about somebody saving up so they can go to an evening class the following year and, you know, chatting up the neighbours so they will be, you know, helping on the babysitting circuit and so on. I mean, that's self-driven plasticity, and that's pretty ordinary stuff. Most of our plasticity is really self-driven. And think about some of the things we do mechanically, apparently. They're the result of a lot of effort. Think about catching a ball, which I do occasionally, I'm not very well, but it's the result of lots and lots of attempts. So, yeah, I agree plasticity is important, but it's funny how we keep on pushing everything back into the brain again, isn't it? It escapes from the brain into the body. Pierre omits as the body, which is unusual amongst neuroscientists. And then, but he's still not very happy with what Steve was pointing out, which is the social world. Actually, our bodies are in a state of transcendent relation to other bodies. They're not just sealed off as pieces of meat. And it's this community of minds in which we actually live and exist. This world, being in the world, that is essential to us. And it's in that context that we drive our own plasticity and forge what free will that we have.
To win the game, you try to find error and to reduce things to facts which are either right or wrong. And of course, scientific practice in leading laboratories where people are having the most creative thoughts doesn't work in that kind of way. I mean, there's kind of give and take when you publish and at conferences and so on, but there's a lot that's kind of taken for granted and accepted, and you know, you're just put aside and we'll see. Well, you might be wrong about that, but you might be right. I mean, even as Pierre was saying, you know, there are two big theories in this. This is mine, but the other one might be right. You know, but you can't say that in court because you're trying to win a case. So that precisely the adversarial nature of these has as an unintended consequence that it has a rather rough and uncomfortable to science kind of characteristic to it. And that's really what I was concerned about, rather than the cheapness of it.
Just a quick follow-up, because it's interesting. Would the inquisitorial system, like the French, treat this science better?
No, I mean, that is very interesting. I mean, I think one of the striking things is that not enough work has been done on the Napoleonic code in relation to these things. So, I mean, I think there are a few studies, but in fact, all of the problems of, as it were, people not being challenged tends to be the characteristic problem there. So I'm not saying that that is better, but that you need to understand what the characteristic problems of the of the adversarial system are. But I think you're right. In the Napoleonic system, the problem is you kind of get capture by one theory or the other, and then they miss out on all the rival possibilities. Sorry, we're going miles off. Now, I mean, as well as it being an intersubjective thing, I mean, I think that our philosophy of action, our understanding of ourselves, I mean, there's a way in which I think it's important to see this as a kind of a theory that we all hold, but it's kind of a theory of ourselves that we operate with. And like most, or possibly all theories, it isn't absolutely right. And I think that, in a sense, the fix that we get in with this, the paradoxes and thrown up by neurobiology are indicating the weaknesses of this theory of self that we all commonly share. But of course, we haven't built up enough problems yet that we want to throw it away and come up with something else, and there isn't very obvious a good alternative around at the moment. But with regard to, I mean, the point that was raised by the teaching professionals here about the prescription of Ritalin and so on, I mean, I find that absolutely terrifying, because in a sense what that does is it creates a little hole inside our theory and just tries to plug it with something without any very good notion of how that ties in to other notions of responsibility and action. That seems to me the grossest and most simplistic, I'm having another cheap shot, I guess, here, but maybe one that will land me in less trouble. But, I mean, that seems to me that, we've got this enormously complex and, subtly applied theory, and then smack, we just say, oh, have some Ritalin, and well, let's see what happens. And I think that's just terrifying.
But that in itself is kind of the way that when you come across the application of neuroscience in a crude way, then you're not talking about an esoteric argument about do we have free will or not. We're talking about the implications of that directly in policy, say, in the way that education is understood, or the way that the law is changed in terms of particular aspects of culpability, whether you use lie detectors or not. And I think that drive to bring in that kind of evidence-based scientific backup kind of approach to how we reconceive the law or education is really what worries me.
Yeah, no, I mean,
we're conceding a lot. All right? What I'll do is I'll go out to the audience and a round of questions, and then we'll just about have enough time to have a very quick summary.
Okay.
So,
can I not go fourth next time, though?
Okay, if you like.
Thank you.
Can you come down the front and do this gentleman here, and then if we do that lad sat down there.
Sorry about this, Pierre. No problem.
Thank you. I'd like to get back to Jeffrey and his the amygdala level proving to be the best predictor, because Damasio would have predicted that Raymond Tallis probably wouldn't. Correct. And that's an interesting thing that I'd like to expand on, because that was part of your unconscious system. And in this sense, I think we can see that the law is already a biological ass, because it assumes people make decisions in a way we know they don't make decisions. And at a trivial level, we are, for example, favour taller people for a whole range of reasons. We favour sweeter foods. And at a more serious level, some of these unconscious things may contribute to criminal behaviour. And it seems to me public policy, whether it's about law or health, needs to understand how people really make decisions and not how the liberal imagination might like to think it makes decisions.
Oh dear, right.
Hello. The first speaker said that that we are our brains and that we should be responsible for what our brains do. But then at the end of your speech, you, as an aside, said, except for when people have provable brain damage and things. But where do you draw the distinction? Isn't that the same issue?
Great. And you, and then next be this gentleman here with the blue shirt jumper on.
Okay, an idea came up in this discussion, which also came up in reference to climate change this morning, which is that, is it true that science can do its pure research for finding out things about the way we work, and then the moral, social, political, legal questions all come afterwards? And I just want to challenge that. Although there are separate arenas of debate, I don't think they are separable. And the first example came up in the discussion is that research funding is involved here, and this is currently a very fashionable area. The journals love papers on this kind of thing, and it does have an impact back on the science that is done. And secondly, to give an example, if you do a study and find a very strong marker, for example, of someone who's going to commit violent sexual crimes or be a paedophile, for example, once you have that knowledge, there are objections both to using it and to not using it. And so my question is, and it's not really my point of view, it's more a question, is whether it's a task purely for legislation to decide what to do with pure science, or whether there are some things that really we don't want to know, or that we should really think about which directions research is going. And I'm not trying to suppress intellectual endeavour, I'm just saying that there are things that bounce back here. And it's a very similar question to that which comes up with genetics. Knowledge that can be used to prepare or mitigate for future consequences. Is it A, ever accurate enough, and B, beneficial enough to outweigh the dangers of how we can integrate its challenges into the law?
Thank you.
Two quick methodological points, I guess, both closely related to what Steve's been saying. The first is, I am not my brain. You know, I look at my brain as the material that I write myself in, and not the only one. I write myself in notebooks. I do it in my relationships to other people, in the environment that I create around myself, in the network of people that I form through work. All these things are aspects of myself which do not reside in my brain. And so as the sort of first methodological point is, until you can put that entire network of relationships on a slide under a microscope, I don't think you should have any confidence that what you're looking at is me. So that would be the first point. The second is, every neuroscientist that I've had a debate with, I've always been slightly appalled by their, well, I've debated with people like Pinker and Joseph Ledoux and people of that order, seem to be, to me, quite naive about where the divide comes between physics and metaphysics. They don't seem to have a great grasp of the complexity of what we mean by causation. Of causal relationships.
Okay.
So I think there may be a slight naivety there which causes people to overreach and misapply the findings of their own domain in a larger domain which has proved resistant to great analysis over thousands of years.
Thank you. You sir, and this young lady.
Just some of the things said on the panel makes me want to pose a question. Are we at risk of criminalising certain types of brain activity when those same brain activity that give you the rage to maybe commit a violent act might also be the types of brain activity that cause you to ditch work so you can protest the invasion of the Iraq War or ask a question at Battle of Ideas? So are we at risk of, when we analyse these things, when they occur in a criminal context, incorrectly assuming that these types of brain activity only occur during criminal activity?
I feel the same way with the lady in the black at the front. I feel like we're ignoring the philosophical side of things, and we're looking at this as empiricists. We're trying to decipher human behavior based on the brain, and I don't feel that that is enough. If we switch this around and said, my mind made me do this, we cannot possibly decipher the mind. So is there really much point in us trying to decipher human behavior based on the brain?
Thank you.
Apart from neuroscience, to what extent does psychiatry play a part in all this? I'm thinking of obsessive-compulsive disorder, which obviously denies free will, and addiction, which obviously consumes so much, or crimes related to addiction consume so much time in the criminal justice system and take up so many places in our prisons, and yet addiction is designated as a disease and certainly not as a result of free will.
Yeah, Russell reminds us that science tells us what we can know, but what we can know is little. However, so we're busy here denouncing the hubris of people who say that we, make these very crass and simplistic claims. But I think there's an aspect of this which we shouldn't lose sight of. There's actually a tremendous futuristic optimism in the idea that perhaps perhaps one day we might be able, in a completely empirically scientific way, to achieve all of this, to map all of the facts of the case socially and biologically, and come up with a complete account of a human being. It won't be for centuries yet, it's absolutely clear. But the aspiration to understand empirically and in absolute detail what's going on not something we should abandon merely because we can't use it at the moment. I think that needs to be always kept. You know, the sky is still there.
Can we take it round the back? Right at the back.
Okay, I'm from a psychology background, and I suppose philosophically speaking, my viewpoint would be that I don't really think we actually do have free will, and I rather agree with the Buddhists that the concept that we call I is really something of an illusion. But nonetheless, I do think that for the greater good, it is necessary, nonetheless, to maintain the fiction that we do have free will. This does lead to the position that, legally speaking, we do, as the speaker here, I think, was saying, have to carve up certain boundaries, and that will, of course, mean that, occasionally people may be treated unfairly, but in the long run, that will be for the good. So, for example, it might mean that people who've committed murder, but it turns out, for example, they've got a brain tumour, that may well be mitigation, and that they should not be punished, and they have an operation and so forth. Whereas people who commit murder, and it turns out, say that they've inherited a genetic predisposition to explosive aggression, from one or other parents, that's just the luck of the genetic lottery, and there's not much you can do about it. And I wonder what the panel would think of that.
Not a very happy thought. What we'll do is we take the last few comments from the floor, and then I'm going to ask the speakers to throw in their final comments. So if you want to speak, keep your hand up, and I'll try and take as many as I can. Right, there's a lady at the back, and then there's a gentleman up there with a stripy shirt on. Is it you?
I'd just like to say that I really hope that we don't discover that there's no free will, because that would mean that the reason I believe in free will is because my brain made me do it, and that's not a good thought.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Right.
Just go for it.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the whole deterministic argument, but what I would say is that it kind of cancels itself out in the courtroom, because you could say that the jurors, their brains made them want to punish the criminal. Yeah.
Okay, we're over there.
First of all, I'd like to say hello to Mr. Perks. You probably don't remember me, but I'm a former pupil of yours from Graveney, so thanks for being a great teacher back then.
Thanks for that.
It's a plant.
One thing I want to bring up is, at what point do you limit the excuses for responsibility? For example, we've talked about the brain, but you could also bring in things like the effects of diet on the brain. For example, all of us know how irritated we can get if we haven't eaten all day. There's all kind of anecdotal stories about if you give kids too many E numbers, how crazy they get. And there was a recent study done on prison populations where when they fed the prisoners improved diets of fruit and vitamin supplements, the incidence of violence against the prison staff was dramatically reduced. So are we going to excuse their past criminal behaviour on the fact that they were brought up in malnourished circumstances and it's not really their fault?
I think we'll take two more. So we'll take this gentleman here and that gentleman in the middle, and then we'll ask the speakers to come back.
Thank you. Kind of dovetailing on from what was just said, and apologies if this is slightly confused. Too many thoughts for one question. I'm interested in the moment before the action much more than how we deal with the consequences, and understanding what we can blame it on. Or where we can appropriate responsibility. And I want to know if the panel think that it's more of a question of how we understand ourselves and our interrelations to our environment. The neuroplasticity that was mentioned, and the interrelation, how this builds as we evolve our understanding of how we relate to our environment. But notably, it seems to me that there seems to be a dislocation of our considerations of the interplay between cause and effect, with technological methods of committing crimes such as firing a gun, and wondering whether this makes us immune to the conception of more immune to complex reasoning in these situations, and makes us feel more invincible, and therefore our reasoning is more direct. I do not like this person, I want him dead, I can do this, bang, dead. And whether the interplay and overplay of pre-programmed instincts and reason, and I'm not sure whether these are conflated in drive or not, maybe this is making my question more stupid. Does this base upon our direct or mediated connection to the events the acts that we commit?
Thank you. The last speaker.
Thanks. It seems this debate is centred mostly around the fact that the statement, "my brain made me do it," is more inconvenient rather than false. So you're going to have to work a lot harder to slot free will in somewhere, because otherwise we're talking about something which is common sense. Because neurodeterminism is obviously very inconvenient and obviously has massive ramifications for responsibility and law. But I didn't think your account of free will in the sense of building ourselves, a philosophical determinist won't swallow that, because he'll just slot it into a much wider causal nexus. So I think you're going to have to work a little bit harder to tell us that it's false rather than inconvenient.
Okay, so I'm going to bring the speakers back. Before I do, I think I find it quite difficult to know exactly what we're getting out of this session in some extent, because I'm not sure whether the people in this room believe in free will or not now. I'd like to think that I've got it and I'm going to act on it, and that's the way I live my life. And in a way, that would be the way I would challenge anybody to prove otherwise. And I just throw that in because I think it'd be useful to look at the reflections from the audience and the discussion we've had, and see if we can come to any attempt at some conclusions on which way this is going. And I'm going to go in the reverse order. Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, if that's the question you want answered, then I'm very interested by what the last questioner said, but except I don't really agree with the assumptions that he made. I mean, that is, I think that we've been saying that my brain made me do it is probably kind of empirically false in many cases, but also it's conceptually inadequate, because the notion of what the sources of the causation or influence goes so wide that it's in some important sense arbitrary just to concentrate on the brain. And of course, once you take them wide enough, well, then you can't really do anything with that information, because it's so inherently complex that whether it's caused or it's free will becomes almost a point of chattering or discussion. There was no empirical payoff in that. So, I mean, I don't see much concern for Dave in are we going to suddenly find out, the headlines, free will was a mistake? That's, it's inconceivable that could happen, not because free will is a kind of theory that might be right or wrong, but that free will is the name of the way that we live, and it's embodied in so many of our institutions. So it's not like it's inconvenient. We could just say, well, we used to do that, but we've grown out of it. There is no other adequate way of talking about these things. Now, I mean, I thought the questions about the distinction between metaphysics and physics were interesting on this. Now, I guess historically there's been a move, the things that we used to see as metaphysical, we've by and large come to think of as physical. Not all of them, but the story of the last 2,500 years has been the bit by bit substitution of bits of metaphysics with physics. And I suspect that this is going to go on for the brain, and I think it's right that it goes on. But I don't see that is necessarily going to be a terribly fearful thing, unless we end up handing it entirely over to the medical community or the probation service or something of that sort. I mean, you could see people who have institutional reasons to run ahead with this thing, but I don't think in intellectual terms that's going to happen. Can I just say one final thing?
Very quick.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you had this concern about policy. I mean, I think the other thing, you're saying, well, we've got all this new knowledge, and how does it influence policy? And I think one of the things that's come out of the questions is how multiple and multiplex the sources of that policy are. So people are doing things in schools, people are doing things in probation service, people are doing things in courts, people are doing things in hospitals, and there is no central command over the policy with regard to these things. And I think, in a way, it would be good to have an oversight of where the policy is going in all these areas, because I think in some areas it's out of step with thinking in others.
Okay, Geoffrey.
Sir, I very much like your Dickensian concern that the law is a biological ass. And my friend Jones had the same concern. The whole point of these experiments is to bring actual legal practice in line with people's brain waves. So Jones wants to brain scan jurors and see which ones are unusually emotional, and maybe the emotional ones would be good in divorce trials and the rational ones in antitrust trials. Judges could be brain scanned to make sure that they're capable of separating their personal views from their legal conclusions. And he also wants to study punishment levels assigned by various legislatures across the globe and make sure that we're not punishing certain crimes much more heavily than people's brain think that they should actually be punished. I have to say that although I find the project really interesting journalistically, this is where I get off the train, because my vision of the law, the whole point of law as I see it, is to have us transcend our emotions and impulses and aspire, however imperfectly, to some kind of ideal of rational, neutral deliberation that actually takes seriously the possibility of neutrality. So the fact that this technology may reveal a dissonance doesn't mean for me that we shouldn't aspire to it. The second thing I want to respond to is the broad group of interesting comments that who's going to save us from this 1984-like stuff? Are we criminalizing thoughts? Are there certain things that we shouldn't know about predilections to bad behavior and so forth? There is a history of this. It's eugenics and biological criminality. It's tended to be in the past progressives who have supported this sort of stuff. The eugenics movement was incredibly popular with American liberals, and it was really just conservative religious denominations that opposed it. So I wouldn't think that the people who are on the side of the angels here will necessarily lead us in a good direction. What do I think we should have to do? You call for oversight. I think what this is my parochial interest, but yes, judges and courts have a role to play here. The English and American law is not very good about conceiving the privacy issues that we've been talking about, because we tend to think of privacy as property. You can't come into my house. But what about, can you seize my brainwaves? Do I put my brainwaves out the way I put out the trash? Should a notion of cognitive liberty be rooted in the freedom from compulsory testimony? These are hard questions. We've only begun to think about them, but they're all answerable by analogy and by historical example and so forth. So we need the kind of debate we're having here, and ultimately these questions will be decided in politics and in the courts.
Thank you. Pierre.
Okay, well, just to be very short, so I will finish with a punchline in a way. I mean, I think that we have free will, but that it operates within the constraints of a brain that was built from experience, from also the integration of two determinisms, genetic and environmental determinisms. So it's not completely random. There are constraints to this free will which are biological. And I think that the notion, which unfortunately I didn't have much time to elaborate, of pleasure, unpleasure, and homeostasis, which is a fundamental biological principle of living organisms, is the framework within which this free will can operate.
Thank you, Pierre. And lastly, Ray.
I've been told to be very brief, and I just want to pick up one very good question from the lady who was sitting up high. But basically, that implying that essentially I was a sort of a la carte. Gentlemen, beg your pardon. When you were sitting down, you can't trust me on anything. I can't even do this. But you were implying that I was a sort of a la carte determinist, or a la Descartes determinist in a way. In other words, that I was, saying that essentially that my brain may be doing it is not a good excuse, but there are circumstances in which we can invoke the brain as an explanation, severe head injury, etc., etc. I guess what it is, for me, the brain is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of consciousness, free will, and all our behaviour. There are certain situations in which that necessary condition is withdrawn from us. For example, when I'm in coma, I lose my free will. So I'm not in any way implying that we are utterly independent of a normally functioning brain, but in most cases, the boundary between a normally functioning brain and one that justifies our attributing people's bad behaviour to abnormal brain activity is not at all clear, and it should not be. It cannot be sorted out with neuroscience. because most of our techniques, although they cost an absolute bomb, millions of pounds, they're incredibly crude. I've just had a paper come through, which I'm on my own today, of a negative result of transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it reminds me just what a very blunt instrument it is, and it's true also, I think, of fMRI. So we mustn't be too dazzled by the technology. Scientists tend to be metaphysically naive, some must point out, but my God, a lot of metaphysicians are hellish scientifically naive.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everyone.